Welcome to the coolest stuff on the planet.
Welcome to the coolest stuff on the planet. I'm Sarah.
And I'm Catherine.
And Catherine, this is a presidential election year, as we know. It's 2012.
We can't avoid it.
I know, as much as we'd like to.
Uh-huh.
And also, this happens to be Memorial Day weekend, so we thought we'd head to our nation's capital, Washington, D.C., and do a little sightseeing today.
Exactly. And we're going to focus our podcast on just one particular area of D.C., which is the National Mall. And that's for a good reason. Nearly 30 million people visit that National Mall every year.
That's shocking,
Isn't
actually.
it? That's a lot of people.
A lot of people.
Yeah, and it was planned more than 230 years ago by a man named Pierre L'Enfant, who also designed the street layout of D.C. He wanted a piece of the center of the city to celebrate the nation's most important leaders.
And of course, that's why we have the National Mall. It's home to our country's most famous monuments like the Jefferson Memorial, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, and the Washington Monument, which we know was damaged in last year's freak earthquake in D.C.
That's right, and they're fixing it right now.
They're still fixing it.
Yeah.
But we can't possibly include all of the monuments in today's podcast, so we're just going to focus on a few of them. A couple that are the newest to the mall, and one that is actually celebrating an anniversary this year.
So the first monument that we want to talk about is the newest addition, which is the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial, which was dedicated this year, 2012. It's located on 4 acres in the southwest corner of the tidal basin, and it's surrounded by cherry trees that bloom annually around the anniversary of Dr. King's death in April. Once you're at the entrance to the memorial, you're going to see 3 massive granite pieces that stand about 30 feet high, and inside there's an enormous carving of Dr. King himself.
And there's also a 450-foot granite inscription wall that includes about 14 of his most notable quotes engraved on it.
Mm-hmm.
And the most recent of those quotes comes from the last sermon he delivered, and it happened to be in D.C. in 1968. It was just 4 days before he was assassinated.
Yeah, and speaking of quotes, you know, there was a little controversy because they shortened the quote, the drum major for justice quote. And, you know, some people complain that that sort of changed the meaning of it. So they've talked about changing it and putting the full quote, but I'm wondering how they're really going to do that.
I don't know. Maybe they'll make the letter smaller. Who knows?
Yeah, exactly. And then next is the World War II Memorial. And this one, I was really surprised to find out that it had just come into fruition.
So long after the war ended.
Right. It was like in 2004 is when it was dedicated.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and this was commissioned by President Clinton in 1993, which is about 50 years after the war.
Mm-hmm.
And the approval process was rushed so they could still build the memorial while veterans of World War II were alive. So construction began in 2001, and it was dedicated by George W. Bush 3 years later in 2004, which is really fast.
Very fast, considering how long some of the other memorials have taken.
Exactly.
And the World War II Memorial was designed by Friedrich St. Florian, and it sits between the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument.
Mm-hmm.
And it's split into 2 sections to represent both the Atlantic and Pacific theaters. And you'll see 56 granite pillars arranged in a semicircle that are around a plaza and a water feature.
Uh-huh.
And it's dominated by 2 43-foot arches.
Wow.
And there's also what they call a freedom wall, and the wall is covered with 4,048 different gold stars, and each one of those stars represents every 100 Americans who died in World War II. So think about that. That's a lot of Americans that died during the war.
That's like over 400,000 people.
Mm-hmm.
That's huge. So finally, we wanted to mention the Lincoln Memorial because it's very prominent on the mall. Everybody knows it. But also it happens to be this year its 90th anniversary, and it was actually dedicated on Memorial Day in 1922.
The Lincoln Memorial, like you said, is so prominent. It's very recognizable, and it served as a site of some of our nation's most important demonstrations and speeches, including Martin Luther King's very famous I Have a Dream speech.
Oh yeah, you always see that picture of him standing with that in the background.
Exactly.
The Lincoln Memorial is surrounded by 36 Doric columns, one for each of the states that was part of the Union at the time of his death in the 1860s. But by the time construction was actually finished in 1922, there were 12 more states that had joined the Union, so the names of all 48 are carved on the monument. And then the entire text of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address and the second inaugural address are also inscribed on the interior walls.
Well, that just about wrapped things up, but as we mentioned earlier, close to 30 million people visit the National Mall every year. And this is another shocking statistic that I found out. That 30 million people that visit the mall, that's more visitors touring the mall than Yellowstone, Yosemite, and Grand Canyon National Park combined.
Wow, that's a lot.
So with that many people, the mall has fallen into disrepair. But the good news is there's action right now in place to restore it. It's called the National Mall Plan. And there's a trust set up. It's called the Trust for the National Mall. And their goal is to raise $350 million of the $650 million or so dollars that is needed to repair the mall.
Wow.
And there's so many details about this that we just didn't have time to really cover it in the podcast, but we're going to include tons of information in the blog.
It's really a shame that, you know, they haven't had the funding from the government to just maintain it, because it's been, as they would say, loved to death by the numbers of people who come in.
It really has been loved to death, and it hasn't had any upkeep or restoration since the bicentennial, which was in 1976, so it really needs this, you know, total overhaul. So we're going to have lots of details on that and how you can donate to the Trust for the National Mall also. So look for that on our blog.
Yeah, please do. And also follow us on Twitter and Facebook, or drop us an email. Let us know what you think of our podcast. And all of those details will be found at the end of the podcast.
And we'll see you next time on The Coolest Stuff on the Planet.
For more on this and thousands of other topics, visit HowStuffWorks.com. Don't forget to check out our other podcasts, free on iTunes.